Welcome back, everybody. I am super psyched to announce my new series on turboing my 94 1.8 liter Mazda Miata. This series is going to be for the do-it-yourselfer. We're not going to be installing a kit. We're not going to be, just bolting things on. There is some actual engineering involved and some choices that need to be made. So that's what this is really going to be about. It's how to do it from scratch. All the way from the hoses and fittings that you need to the turbo choices, the manifold choices, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to be covering all the things you should do to prep your car before going turbo and all the stuff that you need to do it. And I'm going to take you through everything that's going to happen on this car, all the choices I make, and I'll provide a list of all the different things that I bought for the car, and we're going to see at the end of this process how much did it really cost. So we're going to make some decisions based on the budget, but we're not going to cut any corners or any major corners. We're going to use quality parts, and we're going to put everything together in a way that is reliable. That's the ultimate goal. There's a lot of ways to use forced induction in your car, but at the end of the day, it's going to pop your motor. You don't want that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Maintenance. It's not very sexy, but it's something you definitely need to look into before turboing your vehicle. So when you turbocharge or use any kind of forced induction on a car, it's going to put extreme stress on all the systems of the car. So that includes your engine, your cooling system, ignition system, fuel system. All those things are required to be up to snuff to be able to support the additional power that's going to come out of it. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad day. So, number one, the first thing to look at is your fuel system. Now, the stock fuel pump on a Miata and the stock fuel pressure regulator on a Miata is perfectly adequate up to even 200 horsepower or even a little bit more. However, you want to make sure that your stock pump is actually working effectively. So I've got a video where I do in my fuel series that talks about how to test the fuel pressure, and I'm going to leave a link to that up above that you can click on. So moving from the pump, you'll also want to look at your fuel filter. So if you haven't changed it yourself or it hasn't been changed in a while, go ahead and change that out before you do anything else. If you have a drop in fuel pressure while you're at high RPM and high load, then it's definitely a bad day for you and your engine is not going to like it. So that's another thing to look at. The next thing that you want to look at is your injectors, and at the very least you'll want to make sure your injectors are working adequately and are clean. You might want to run a in-tank fuel system cleaner, but the stock injectors are good for a bit of a bump of horsepower, maybe not up to 175 or something like that. They'll be operating at a pretty high duty cycle. However, that's something that we're going to get into with mods that you can do to your car before you go turbo, and that'll be in the next section. You're also going to want to look at your ignition system. So make sure that your spark plug wires, or if you've converted to a coil pack, are in good shape and are firing adequately. Now you're going to be replacing your spark plugs. So you're going to go to a colder spark plug than stock so that the spark is appropriate for the pressures that you're going to have inside the combustion chamber. So we're going to cover that in a bit, exactly what spark plug to get. However, your wires and coils should be in good shape. Next, you're going to want to look at your cooling system. So if you have not replaced the radiator or have not flushed the radiator in a while, now is a good time to do that. If you're on a stock radiator, I recommend replacing it. You can go to a all aluminum style radiator. It does not need to be super thick actually to provide adequate cooling. The 2-inch radiator cores are kind of a little bit overkill, but it all depends on the amount of power that you're going to be making. So we'll be talking about that in future videos. However, you want that thing to be flowing and cooling very well. So you can replace it, the radiator, and also check the hoses. Anything rubber on the car really should be looked at extensively and potentially replaced. So that includes all of your coolant hoses, check for pliability, check for cracks. It includes all of your vacuum hoses, check for pliability, check for cracks. And it also can include your fuel line hoses. There's a couple of hoses in the engine bay and a couple more in the back at the tank. And so all those can be checked and replaced if necessary. Now the next thing is, from a maintenance perspective, that you want to ensure is there's no reason to pour a bunch of time and money into a car that doesn't have a sound engine to start with. And the way that you can test if an engine is sound and is going to be able to put up with the additional pressures and the strenuousness of forced induction is through doing a few simple tests, like a compression test and a leak down test. And the compression test is going to tell you that your rings are good and that your valves are sealing correctly. And it's going to tell you if there's any problem areas. It's not so much the number of the compression, but a big indicator of a problem is if three of your pistons are compressing at about the same number, but one is off. Maybe it's either higher or a lot lower than the other three. And that can tell you a few things about your car. So you want to address that. We're not going to cover that in this video series. There's a lot of videos on YouTube that cover compression tests and leak down tests, what they can test, what they can't test, and what you can do about the results that you get back from them. But it's something that you definitely should look at because, like I said, you don't want to be putting forced induction into an engine which can't deal with it. Pre-turbo mods. So there are a lot of modifications you can make to your car that will support your turbo build, but are things you can do and drive around with naturally aspirated. So the first thing I recommend as a pre-turbo mod is to go ahead and get yourself a standalone ECU. And so the one I recommend is definitely a Megasquirt. That has some of the most support in the Miata community, and it's also very full-featured and inexpensive. So this is something that can be built and installed for less than about $600. You can get a used one for in the $300 to $400 range, probably an MS2, a little bit older, but still will get you all the standalone features that you really want. And this can give you the ability to practice tuning on a naturally aspirated car, which is much safer. It's very difficult to really cause any kind of lasting damage to your naturally aspirated car on a bad tune, as opposed to the damage that you can wreak on a turbo car with a bad tune. You can definitely cause a lot of damage there. So it's best to have a nice sandbox to play in that allows you to learn the basics of tuning and how this stuff works before you get into an area which can cause you trouble. Along with the standalone ECU, I recommend going ahead and getting a wideband. Now, even if you don't have the standalone ECU, you can actually do the wideband first, because a lot of widebands will support a simulated narrowband output. So the wideband gives you the ability to see your AFR all the way from a 7 or 8 super rich AFR to air-fuel ratio to a 20, which is very lean air-fuel ratio. And so that's the basis of any kind of tune. You need that to be able to effectively tune your car. However, if you haven't got your standalone ECU yet, most widebands output a simulated signal, a narrowband signal of 0 to 1 volt, which basically tells the ECU whether it's at stoichiometric or not. It's kind of a either-or situation. And so that's what the ECU is used to, and that works fine. I've done that myself for many months, and there was no issues in doing that. So the third mod that I recommend before even turboing your car is injectors. In today's world, there is a index of injectors. It's known as an EV14. There's a lot of manufacturers, they usually use a Bosch style injector, but there's a lot of people that make injectors that are using this EV14 index, which provide a very good spray pattern that allows you to run a much bigger injector that will idle just fine on a naturally aspirated car. Back in the old days, it was impossible to get big injectors without having, pretty much a crappy idle. Well, those days are over. Back in the day, it was a good idea to you could get on a budget RX-7 style injectors that were 440 cc's, that kind of stuff. You can still do that because they're dirt cheap, and you can get them used for practically nothing. But there's a reason for that, and the reason is because they can be problematic. They won't make as much power. They're way more annoying than the EV14s. So I definitely recommend going that route. Now, we talked about the fuel system of how you can upgrade your pump. Now, when I had my stock fuel pump go out, and I went ahead and upgraded it to a DW200, Dieselwork 200, and that's good for 350, 400 horsepower in terms of how much it can pump, liters per hour. So that's good, but you don't have to do that. You just need to make sure that your pump is working correctly. So another thing to note about the standalone ECU, you can get these piggyback units or do little tweaks with your fuel pressure regulator and stuff like that. I don't really recommend that. And the reason is because honestly, they're not that cheap over the long term, because they still cost $200 to $300, and you're getting so much less than if you were to just spend the $500 to $600 on it, or even less if it's used on a full standalone ECU. Now, the last thing you may want to do before turboing your car is replace the clutch. Now, you may have a perfectly good clutch, but it will not be perfectly good after you put a lot more power through it than stock. The stock clutch on any generation Miata is sort of weak and is tuned specifically for the stock power. And so as soon as you start making anything, 30, 40, 50 horsepower or more than stock, it's going to be slipping, and that clutch is going to burn up pretty quickly. Now, you can wait for that to happen and replace it when it actually does completely go, but your clutch could go out and leave you stranded somewhere as well. So that's something else to look into before you turbo your car. You need a plan. So before you turbo your car, you're going to come up with a plan for exactly kind of what you're going to do. You need to know what the anticipated power level is, and to meet that power goal, you're going to want to figure out what kind of turbo you want and manifold that you want to get. And I say those two together because they go together. Your turbo manifold is going to fit with particular turbos. And the most common on the Miata community is a manifold that works for a T3 type of fitting, that style of fitting of turbo, or a T25 or T2, that kind of thing. And so there are basically two types of manifolds that you'll be looking at. You can get the cast kind of log style manifolds, which are cast iron, and those are pretty dependable. They will take a lot of abuse before anything bad happens with them, like a cracking or something like that. And you can even get eBay type of specials on that sort of stuff. For $100 to $150, you can get either a T3 or T25 style cast log manifold, which will do pretty well in the circumstances of a DIY build. Now, that's the direction I'm going to take. You can also get a welded manifold, pretty much pay whatever you want. I do warn you that the eBay units are prone to cracking very quickly, and the pricier units probably won't crack for some time, but it's just the nature of the beast. When you put a lot of heat through a bunch of welds and you heat cycle it over time, those welds will crack at some point and may need to be repaired, or it may just need to be thrown away completely and you buy a new one. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing you need to consider is the downpipe. How are you going to connect up your turbo to your exhaust? And so the downpipe is also something that can be purchased separately, where you don't have to do anything, or it can be DIY'd. You can buy flanges and things like that and actually weld it up yourself. And you can save quite a bit of money if you have some fabrication and welding skills. And so in this series, we're actually going to be doing that. We're going to be welding up a downpipe and connecting it to our existing exhaust. And then eventually we're going to be replacing the exhaust with a full 3-inch system all the way from turbo to tail tip. So that'll be interesting. So exhaust is another aspect which you'll need to consider as part of your plan, and how to figure out all the little details. The turbos themselves come in a couple different varieties. You can get what's called journal bearing turbo, which means that it's just mostly lubricated by the oil itself, or ball bearing turbos, which are more expensive and lubricated by the oil and ball bearings, and can result in a higher or quicker spool time. With ball bearing turbos, you can expect a couple hundred RPMs earlier worth of spool than with a similarly sized journal bearing turbo. So that's something to look into. The other thing is turbos can come in varieties in which you get a oil cooled or water cooled, and it's a little bit of a misnomer that it's water cooled. Turbos are in large portion cooled by the oil, regardless of whether they have water lines or not. What water lines do is they increase the reliability of the turbo and prevent the turbo from getting coked up with, basically, when the car is turned off and the oil starts flowing, that oil that's left in the turbo will just bake in there because of the residual heat of the turbo itself. And so that's what's called coking up. It basically puts a lot of carbon inside the turbo, and over time that can cause increased pressures inside, which cause the seals to blow and the turbo to start smoking. This is not a good thing. So the water lines have a residual flow of cooling through the turbo. So when you turn the car off, you don't need a turbo timer or something old school like that. It will continue to draw heat away from the turbo and prevent that kind of carbon buildup inside the turbo. And a water cooled turbo, even if you get it used, can have a significant life. And that's why a lot of turbos, even from the 90s and so on, that are water and oil cooled, will have a life well in excess of 150,000 miles and be perfectly reliable. Which brings me to my next topic, oil and water lines and fittings. Oh, the fittings, so many fittings. There are a lot of different ways to bring oil in to the turbo and then really sort of one out to the turbo, as well as water lines. And so we can discuss and show a few of those different options. With oil lines in the Miata, especially the NA Miatas all the way through 95, there is a high pressure oil feed line on the block that you can use. And so this feed line is perfect because it's on the correct side of the engine, the driver's side of the engine, where you're going to be placing the turbo and where the exhaust is. And it can give you a short line that can go into the input port, oil port of the turbo itself. Now, on a later model of NA, so 96 and above, to an MB Miata and later, you'll be wanting to source the oil from around the other side of the block, and most people will use an oil filter sandwich plate, and so that will go on top in between the oil filter and the block and provide you with ports to run your lines from. Now, in all cases, the oil drain, which should drain straight down from the turbo, and we'll talk about how to clock your turbo correctly so that it has the proper directional flow from gravity for the oil and for water in a future video when we set up the turbo itself. But basically, this goes down and into, you're going to drill into your oil pan. It needs a way to go into, get back to the oil pan. And so we drill kind of as high as possible on the side of the oil pan, and we screw in a fitting which the line is going to connect to. Now, in this series, I'm actually going to be doing lines and fittings which are all using the -AN style fittings everywhere. You don't really have to go this direction, but I found that it was not that much more expensive, and it kind of provides a little bit more peace of mind having these fittings that you make and then screw together, as opposed to simply sliding on hose that goes over a hose barb. It's a little bit more reliable, and you can get the steel braided style hoses, and which give a little bit more protection to the hose itself and heat resistance. Next up is air, and that's air into the turbo and out of the turbo. So the input to the turbo is pretty straightforward. You're going to basically have some piping, and it's going to match up to the size of the inlet of your particular turbo, which could be anywhere from 2 inches to 3 inches usually. And you can use either like some aluminum piping or with some silicone connectors, or just pure silicone piping, and it's going to connect to a new filter that you're going to get. And that part's pretty straightforward. The next decision point to be made is whether you're going to run an intercooler or not. And I really recommend do, unless your power levels are very low. Like if you're only going to be running, like say, 4 psi or something like that, then you might be able to get away without an intercooler. However, by compressing the air, it heats up, and that hot air is going to enter your engine, and because it's so hot, it can increase the chances of pre-detonation. And so that's the bad thing that you don't want to happen within your engine, because that's what bends rods and breaks pistons. So an intercooler is going to take the output air of your turbo. You're going to have a pipe that can be routed in a variety of different ways, and it's going to go to this radiator looking thing on the front of the car. And the reason we say front of the car is because in a Miata, front mount intercooler is definitely the way to go. There's a variety of ways to do intercoolers. You could have a water to air intercooler, that kind of thing. That's sort of a waste of time, and also just piping and complexity of the system, and also weight. That water is not weightless. So the only reason people use water based intercoolers is because of the packaging problems, that they don't have the ability to pipe in an air cooled intercooler, and especially for like say a mid-engine car or something like that. And so they need to have the air cooling off. Basically, the water takes away the heat from the air that's in the intake, and then that goes through, it gets cooled by coolant, and then that coolant gets cooled by an extra radiator basically at some point in the car. So this is inherently less efficient than just simply drawing the heat out through the ambient air. That the lowest the temperature can get in that is the ambient air temperature. However, the lowest the temperature can get in a water-cooled intercooler is the temperature of the water, which is always higher after the engine's been running than ambient. So it's inherently less efficient. The air is then going to, once it's cooled off, the charged air is going to go into the throttle body, and you're also going to put in your sensor on that side that the ECU is going to need to have, and because it needs to know the pressure and the air temperature to be able to regulate fueling correctly. So there's going to be piping involved. There's going to be tapping for ports for this temperature sensor, and there's also going to need to be piping for a blow-off valve. Now, a blow-off valve in some cases can also be optional. However, what a blow-off valve does is when the turbo is spinning up and you're doing one of these pulls and then you let off the throttle, immediately what happens? Well, the throttle body butterfly plate closes, and all that air that was rushing into the engine stops. It hits that plate, and temporarily it has no place to go but backwards. So it causes a quick burst of pressure that goes back into the turbo, and that can actually damage the turbo compressor wheel, and you don't want that. So what a blow-off valve does is when it detects that pressure spike, it will blow off the air either into the atmosphere, or it will recirculate it back to the intake, either one. And so you need a plan for dealing with that to help you keep your turbo as happy as possible. Okay, so we've got our manifold figured out. We've got our turbo connected to it. We've got a downpipe situation. We've got an exhaust set up. We've got our fittings for our oil and optionally water lines as well. Our oil is draining into our oil pan, and we've got the oil pan modified to accept it. We've got intakes with the filter, and we've got the air outlet, which goes through an intercooler and back into the throttle body, which is properly piped to a blow-off valve or bypass valve. We're ready to go, right? We're gonna do some mad pulls around town and be boosting left and right. Well, not quite yet. There's still a few things that we might want to take care of. Number one is, right now we have in the stock Miata or any car, there is a PCV valve that is connecting our intake manifold to the head. And in that, with that valve, it's not expecting to be under boost. The intake manifold in a naturally aspirated car is always either in slight vacuum or is at ambient pressure. And so if you introduce boost into the situation, you may be introducing that pressure into your crankcase. That is not good. Your crankcase should not be under positive pressure. And so that's what the PCV valve, positive crankcase ventilation valve, does, is it releases that. So you're going to want to change out that valve so that it can deal with boost. You can replace it with a valve that is meant for that, meaning a valve from a turbo car. And a lot of people use the Mazda 323 PCV valve. However, that car is only rated to about 7 or 8 psi, and after that, it will start to leak. So a lot of turbos, 7 or 8 psi is wastegate pressure. You're not getting anything massive, and a lot of people want to run 10, 14, even 20 psi. And so that type of thing is not going to cut it. So what you may want to add to that line is a check valve that's rated for as high or much higher than the boost that you plan to be making, so that you're not inappropriately adding boost to your crankcase. So that's something to look at. The next thing to look at is some accessories. You may want to have in the car, in addition to your standalone ECU with your laptop for tuning, some actual gauges that show you kind of what's going on. The two gauges that I feel are most important are an AFR gauge that you can just keep an eye on all the time and see that you're not getting too lean and that you're not running too rich, which is just kind of a waste. And the boost gauge, which tells you that your boost pressures are maintaining the way you intended them to work. And so those two gauges are kind of what you need. You don't really need a bunch of other gauges unless you really want to. It can always be good to get a real fuel pressure gauge if your car doesn't come with one. If you have a 95 or lower car, then you probably have a real fuel pressure gauge as opposed to a dummy gauge. If your car is a 95 and a half model year or higher, then you probably have a dummy fuel pressure. Oil pressure gauge in your car, and it's basically saying okay until the second it's not, which is going to be too late. So you may want to replace that. So those are the types of accessories and other things that you'll want to look into before you actually start boosting around town. Next thing you want to take a look at is your cooling system. Now, I mentioned replacing your radiator. You can always upgrade your radiator at the same time, making sure that hoses are correct. But one thing that's special within the Miata world is what's called a coolant reroute. Now, the Miata, because it was originally meant for a different car, the Miata engine, especially in the NA, was meant for a different car. It was mounted in a different way. The coolant routing from the factory is a little crazy. It kind of enters from the front and it also exits from the front, which can leave some hot spots around cylinder 4. So that's not a good thing when you're either in a super hot environment. It can overheat just stock, or if you're if you're doing forced induction with turbo or supercharging. So when you turbo or supercharge your car, you definitely want to look into a Coolant Reroute. Now there are a lot of different options for that. There's fairly numerous kits that you can buy to redirect the coolant so that it comes in the front of the engine where it normally is, where the water pump exists, and then out the back of the block so that it's passing through the entire block and not leaving any of these hot spots around cylinder 4, as I mentioned. In this series, we're going to do a special kind of DIY style coolant reroute, which I don't know if I necessarily recommend for everybody. It's not going to fit for everybody's situation, but it's going to work for me. And I'm just going to do a detailed thing on how that reroute works. It's very simple, and it doesn't require a $200 or $250 kit, so you can save a little bit of money there by doing it that way. But definitely from a cooling aspect, that's important to look into. Also, on the topic of cooling, when you've implemented your intercooler system and your radiator, there may be modifications that had to be made to your splash guard or under tray and other types of ducting that exists on the car stock. You'll want to return that as closely as possible to stock as you can. And the reason is, any cooling system is only as good as the ducting that you put around it. So if the air has the opportunity to travel somewhere else, it will. You want it to go straight in the mouth of the car and through the intercooler, through the radiator, and out the back so that it can remove as much heat as possible. You do not want to be inadvertently pressurizing your engine bay with things like turn signal intakes, with hood risers, different types of things which are just bad. So we're going to have, when we do the coolant reroute video, we're going to talk about a lot of the bad things that you should not do to your car that people think help with the cooling situation, and they do not. So what you want to do is have the appropriate ducting through, let the radiator do its work. Now, heat can also be damaging to other components in your car. Normally, in a naturally aspirated car, the heat is localized to the exhaust. There's a heat shield on the stock exhaust, and most of the heat is carried down through the tailpipe and out the back of the car. Now, in a turbo, a lot more heat is under hood at this point. And so you're going to want to take steps to protect the components that are around that area, such as your clutch and brake cylinders, and other hoses that are going into the heater core that are right next to the downpipe. And you're going to want to protect the area where you have your intake, your air filter, because you don't need to be sucking that hot air that's right next to the exhaust into the engine. You want to have as cold air as possible, or as close to ambient air as possible, to go into your intake system. So by putting proper heat shielding around the car in appropriate places, then you can maximize all the power gains that you can get. Well, I hope you enjoyed this overview. I hope that gave you some things to think about. As we continue in this series, we are going to touch on all the different things that I talked about there in separate videos, which will be detailed, and we'll have parts lists shown so that you know exactly what's being put on the car and how much those things cost. We are going to show you all the details of how this is going to work, and in the next video that I have planned, we're going to start the disassembly process and show you the manifold and turbo that I purchased and how those mount on the car. So stay tuned for that. Thanks a lot for everybody for watching, and we will see you in the next one. If you enjoyed this content, please drop me a thumbs up below, and don't forget to click to subscribe. Thanks.